you gonna get free this time? Falling into a blue sky mind. Came to me in that song, my friend.
Hello, this is Deb Ayer, your host of You, Me, and the Elephant. Welcome back. Happy summer. Today, the question is, do you ever get lonely? I want to pause on that question for a moment to give you some updates. First of all, we're into a year plus of You, Me, and the Elephant. So I want to congratulate You, Me, and the Elephant and also say thank you to all of our listeners for indulging in these conversations, in honoring the deeper threads that connect us all. In the vein of having a little bit over a year of this podcast, we want to begin to wrap up the first season. We will be giving those announcements when that happens. What we're going to be doing for season 2 is starting to collect some guests so that we can have more engaging conversations with some of these underlying vital themes of our life that we often keep pretty close to ourselves or don't feel like we have a place to truly uncover some of the things that and gems that we can receive from having these conversations. So let's go back to, do you ever get lonely? I want to start by having you put your hands on your chest, taking a slow breath in your nose and exhaling out of your mouth. We're going to do that one more time. And this time on the exhale, let whatever sound, not just the sound of your breath, but whatever sound just wants to come out, that just wants to release before you begin to take in this conversation. So taking that breath in your nose. And then exhale. Excellent. And then I want you to kind of like a rag doll, just like shake every part of your body, not just the upper body, down into your hips, down into your legs. If you can stand up, you can stomp your feet. Almost a week ago now, I woke up and with like this intense, extreme loneliness. It's interesting what happens. And for me, this has certainly evolved over my life. What I mean by that is like, what do I do when I feel lonely? How do I respond to that? Do I just try to get busy? Do I pretend I'm not lonely? Do I go to gratitude or do I do things to move away from what the feeling is within the loneliness? And I'm saying these things because clearly I've done those things. That's the only reason I know how. So the other morning waking up, and this has happened to me several times, this was one of the big kinds of loneliness, meaning for me, I feel like there's no center to me. And I am just this like dust particle in the universe floating around aimlessly with no purpose, with no joy, with not a lot of excitement for life. Yet, interestingly, when it's this, what I call like subatomic existential loneliness, it comes with rich feeling. So the dichotomy is I feel aimless and lost, and yet I feel a lot of feeling, which to me is an indication that I'm very much alive. So, this experience that I had, again, I feel like I've evolved in many different phases of my life, how I relate to loneliness. So I have my own personal experiences in this conversation, as always, of course. And this is one of the subject matters for You Mean the Elephant that's been sitting on my list for probably a year, that along with death. So those two subjects have been sitting there just waiting idly. What happens with me is like these truth bombs come in, and then like my human self is like, am I ready to address this? So along with waking up about a week ago with this experience, also hearing a lot of people in my office of their confusion, of their loneliness, of their feelings of the state of the world and feeling helpless. I often feel like and y'all know what this is like when there's like a trifecta of things that you're like, should really do that thing, and then something comes in that reminds you of that thing. Something else over here in a different part of your life reminds you of that thing. And then there's a third thing. I don't remember what the third thing was, but there was something else that came in. Oh, I know what it was. I just had to give myself permission to not know. We have so much pressure on ourselves to know, to be in check. At least I do. And that when I can just release it, sometimes it flows right back. So I started listening to a podcast that I hadn't actually listened to in probably at least 6 months. And I turned it on, and in part, they were talking about loneliness. So I was like, okay, there's the trifecta. What I'm attempting to do today is pull back and look at loneliness from a different perspective. The question, do you ever get lonely, is somewhat of a setup, because it is in my heart of beliefs that baked into our human nature is loneliness. No one escapes the feeling, the experience of loneliness. Yet we live in a world that doesn't support that inherent knowledge. The basic definition when you look up loneliness is sadness because one has no friends or company, feeling isolated. Loneliness is feeling the gap of discomfort between someone's desire for social connection and the actual experience of it. I just had like a cool wave that came in reading that, and I'll talk to you about it in a moment. And then the quality of loneliness, constant and unrelenting feelings of being alone, separated or divided from others, and the inability to connect on a deeper level. These are some of the things that if you look it up, you're going to get. So if you're feeling lonely and you read this, I'm not sure how supportive it is in conjunction with having a culture that doesn't acknowledge that loneliness is not something that's wrong with us. It is something that is inherent in us to experience. It makes it a difficult path. 50,000 people in the US in 2023 committed suicide. And I think there was like a 25% increase since the pandemic of the prevalence of, and we've talked about this on here before, of anxiety and depression and loneliness. And this was already on the rise. With the pandemic, it makes sense because one of the things that I just read was this experience of feeling isolated, of feeling alone. I want to pull this apart because I think there's some key elements to consider and take in to support your own experiencing when you are feeling lonely, and also really honoring and witnessing the people in your life when they are feeling lonely as well. One of the things, speaking of isolated or alone, is that there is a pretty common thread that we're going to feel lonely when we're alone, that somehow being alone and feeling lonely go hand in hand. I think for the most part, it's a complete myth. And it's not to say that you can't feel lonely when you're alone. But let's break this up a little bit in this part of it, anyways. So far, we know that loneliness is this experience of feeling somehow isolated, feeling like there is a desire for deeper connection, and yet we don't have it. Have you ever felt lonely when you're standing right in front of somebody, when you're in your partnership, when you are parenting, when you are at your job, when you're at a party? Have you ever felt lonely? Have you ever felt isolated while you're in the midst of so many relationshipings? And the answer inevitably is going to be yes. So being alone is not mutually exclusive to loneliness, which means that you can be around lots of people and have lots of connections and still feel lonely. So there's a big fat us too in here. Your loneliness is not alone. My loneliness is aware that that exists in you and to everybody I touch in my world. We can also be alone and feel extremely connected. There are many things that can elicit loneliness, and it doesn't require being alone. But what it does have is feeling disconnected or alone in that disconnection. For me, deep in the center of loneliness is a desire or a longing. In fact, I have a virtual workshop on this very thing. It's called The Sacred Art of Desire. And one of the components that I speak about is the difference between desires and goals, and that inherent in desires is something we call longing. And that longing truly is a bridge to a deeper, truer, broader experience of ourselves. And if any of you listen to our creativity episode, I talk about this vision I had of us before we were incarnated, and we were all bees in a hive, and we're looking down on the world and we're like, that's it. That's what I want to do. That's who I am. That is my purpose. That's what I'm going to go and give to the world. And we fly through the forgetful tree. And by the time we arrive, we forget why we're here. And that part of our journey, or maybe all of our journey in this life, is to remember, not limited to the culture and what the outside world is telling us that we are. That's part of the dance, is remembering beyond what is three-dimensional. There's so many things we experience in life that we think are black and white until we realize there's a whole bunch of color in between those black and white moments. And the whole purpose of these conversations are to uncover, unmask those connected threads between us and the patterns that then exist, and some of the behaviors collectively and some of the challenges actually that happen in our world because of it. So that we have patterned ways of behavior that, even though we think we're so different than the other person, that's the thing. It's both. We are diverse and we are the same, all mixed up. I mean, that is the paradox. I forget who said this. A paradox is the truth standing on its head. So this is one of the paradoxes, that we are our own unique essence, spice in the world. And yet one of the gifts of remembering that uniqueness is seeing the connected threads that we all share through our humanness. There are many things, and especially in this world right now, instead of our diversity being a connection to our uniqueness and a connection to humanity, we are using our diversity to polarize into one or the other. And it's creating more separateness, and therefore even more experiences of isolation. Some of the statistics of what I was mentioning earlier on how prevalent loneliness is. Depression affects 280 million people worldwide and has been cited as the single largest contributor to global disability. I want to say that again, because this goes into what I was just saying, as that, like, we're using diversity to split into two, and we are so much diverse than that. And that I believe the more we can go to, like, finding the patterns that are similar in our diversity, the more it wakes up different sparks of who we are in our uniqueness. And we find more and more wholeness. And when we find more and more wholeness, we then go back out into the world and share that. And that grows, and that becomes a more connected, viable way of living that is not just into two camps. And I'm not just talking politically, it's everywhere that's really being promoted to separate and go against each other. This is really speaking to that. This is the largest single contributor to global disability. So that's why I think this conversation, I feel like millions of people should listen to, because of that very fact. It's sitting right in plain sight, and we are not giving it the time it deserves. Looking at statistics, I would say, wow, loneliness is the true epidemic, right? It is the single factor for global disability. And I'm shifting this and turning it on its head, speaking of paradox, and saying, what if loneliness in itself wasn't the epidemic, but the non-acknowledged consciousness that loneliness is inherent to our existence? We don't know what to do with it, and we either ignore it, we move to drugs, alcohol, we medicate for it, commit suicide. We do all these things because we actually don't realize it's a part of our own being that is natural, and it leads us somewhere if we let it. So the true epidemic is really the inability to understand loneliness. And that's why we're having this conversation today. Loneliness has in the center of it this experience of longing. We long for something we don't have. And if we were able to look at the energetic pattern under loneliness and disattach to, it doesn't mean it means that you're lonely because you don't have friends. It means that you're lonely because you don't have community. It means that you're lonely because you don't have meaning. It means that you're lonely because you're not in partnership. If we could detach from that for a moment, know that those are, in fact, things that help wake up our loneliness, but that loneliness in itself is a longing. Loneliness is a bridge to a deeper meaning and remembering of who you are. When we can look at loneliness, feel into that, and ask, what is the longing? It brings us to what our desires are, which brings us to what are things that we are trying to remember of who we really are. And within that, what life is truly about for us. How I relate to loneliness is through three lenses. And one is the loneliness that I feel in regard to myself. Who am I? What is my purpose? Do I belong? Am I comfortable with who I am? My self worth. So, my relationship to self is one way in which I can experience loneliness. Another way is in regard to other. Now, other in this case could stand for another person. It could be your partner. It could be your child. It could be a community. It could be the culture. It could be the world. It could be your animal. It could be nature. Other is other than you. And the third way that I begin to unpack loneliness is through my connection to the divine, is through my connection to source, whatever that is for you. I want to slow down a moment and review, what are we saying here? We're saying that loneliness is normal. I'm also saying that feeling connected, having a connected body in consciousness and in your sensations is important so that you have the capacity to digest the experiences of loneliness and understand that the more you can remember that loneliness is not just your burden. Even though loneliness can feel like a burden, it is a gateway to connection. Always. The longing that comes seated in loneliness is the quest to remember. It is the sign, it is the bumper that says, you've been going down this path, and I'm going to wake up your loneliness so that you begin to wake up this longing that reminds you that there's deeper connection somewhere in your life to be able to harness, to be able to nurture, to be able to potentially be with some things that sometimes feel very uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, bring you deeper into love, bring you deeper into feeling connected and meaning. And honestly, I think that's what we all want, regardless of our personalities, regardless of where we are in the state of our life or phase of our life. Right now, I want to drop in here because I've been witnessing the despair that people are feeling right now of this helplessness, which I think that's where loneliness can come in when we feel like we don't have an answer for something. Let's say the political climate and the health of our world and how much vitriol is just flying around. And when we have so much heart and desire to give to the world and we feel like we don't know what to do to help the world, it can feel despair invoking. With this, I say us too. What I'm about to go into now is one of the anecdotes for feeling more connected during really challenging moments. You can wake up like I did great the day before and wake up. I felt like I could barely move, like every cell felt alone. I felt lost. And as I have learned to not try to move away or rah rah the experience and let it just flow through me and know that there's wisdom there and know as that moves through my cells and doing the things that feel like they're in alignment. For me, it would be being out in nature, always brings me home. So it allowed my loneliness to be embraced. It allowed my loneliness to be seen. It allowed the loneliness to be hugged and honored. And with that, I always come out with a deeper feeling of connection, a deeper feeling of understanding of some of the feelings that have been lying a little bit when I said subatomic that come out and allow me to feel as more realized. And it guides me on whether it's a next step, whether it's an experience of understanding myself that helps me feel deeper in connection with others, feel deeper in my own heart, or feel more deeper connected to source. So, connection to self. I remembered as I was thinking about this episode, one of my favorite poems is by Oria Mountain Dreamer, and it's called The Invitation. And I believe I read it on our What is Integrity episode. There's this one piece that reminds me of loneliness of self, and it's at the end of the poem. It's actually a calling to that deeper wisdom, that deeper connection to another. It's the invitation to an other for life. And the end of the poem goes like this: I want to know if you can be alone with yourself and if you truly like the company you keep in the empty moments. I love that because it speaks to me in a way of that entanglement that we have, that if I feel lonely, if I can't be with myself, that means I need to be with another. That means that I need to make a friend, that I need to be in a relationship if I'm not in partnership. And I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, know that that is never really the right reason to step into connection. I tease, forgive me, Brewster. Brewster's the name of my younger pup. Brewster gives me challenges in like the best way. He's beautiful. He's just a barky pants. So I always say, yeah, I got Brewster when I should have changed one of my relationships. And I joke about it, but there's a lot of truth in that. There were parts that I was hanging on in a certain way to a certain relationship because of that fear or that entanglement of being alone and loneliness. That's the joke, because we do not escape loneliness. And whether we're alone or we're never alone, being alone for me has been a deep spiritual journey. Before my son moved out, I want to say 4 years ago now, I really never had lived alone. I had been on my own. I've been very independent. I moved to California when I was 18. I lived on my own, but I always had roommates. So I still had this community of living with people. So it's been very intriguing and enticing to me to live alone with my own self, my own empty moments, getting to know my couch for the first time, that for several reasons I never valued. And I think a lot of my life was going so fast that I think sometimes we don't want to slow down because we know there's loneliness underneath there, that if we go fast enough, we're going to escape the loneliness. And we know that doesn't work out so well, because then it comes out in discontent with our relationships. It comes with maybe not eating healthy or bad habits because we're finding some other way to cover up that experience. And sometimes we don't make great choices. We stay in friendships too long that are maybe toxic, or we're blaming ourselves because we truly feel like our judgment comes up a lot in others and in ourselves more when we're trying to escape loneliness, because we're not a good enough parent, we're not a good enough person, this person has done me wrong, becomes more prevalent. This is a great time, whether you are one of those people that have such an active life where you feel like you never get space alone. Where are those moments where you can choose to honor the aloneness? In which way, if you are never alone, can you find and choose to structure in alone time? When we are actively in partnership and if we have young children and we have a full-time job, it becomes very easy not to have alone time. Everything else comes before, and it feels like it's not possible. And yet there is an intellect in here that we know that, of course, it is. And that when we can start speaking that as a value to our partner, to our family, and actually ask for it, then we'll get it. If you've set your life up where so many people depend on you, then that is something that slowly but surely, the more you ask, that's part of the desire. This is the inherent connection between desire, longing, and loneliness. The more you desire, believe it or not, the less you feel the stuckness of loneliness. It wakes up the longing. Loneliness is really a desire in disguise. Loneliness is the piece that says there's more for you, but we don't acknowledge or don't honor it. What to know about desire, longing, and loneliness is that we're not ever really supposed to get rid of it. It is something that keeps the train of the aliveness of the remembering of who we are vibrant. When you can begin to desire and honor that desire and longing and loneliness are all intricately woven to the remembering of self, to finding deeper connection with self, other, and source, then you actually feel lonely less. Sometimes when people feel stress, anxiety, overwhelm, sadness, and I say, hey, you're going to start to feel a wider range of emotion. They're like, no, thank you. And I have to go deeper and say, when you have a broader bandwidth of the capacity to be able to digest the wisdom of emotion, similarly to what I'm talking about as far as desire, loneliness, is that you actually will be less sad on a regular basis. You will be able to be in the sadness. You will be able to digest the sadness and extract the gem that comes with it. And that is the same thing with loneliness. When we are fighting loneliness, the loneliness keeps getting louder because it needs to be louder. It needs your attention. And it's something we can't shake because we're never supposed to shake it. I think the desires are an antidote for the loneliness, meaning the more that we can just be honest with our longings and just give ourselves permission to long. And that doesn't mean that we're not happy for exactly what we have right now. All of these things are important, but when we can wake that up in a way of not accomplishing, then we can start to wake up what we long for, in this case, of ourselves, of who we are. So the next time you feel lonely and those questions of feeling lost, like I did the other day, can you ask the question, what is the longing? Where is this longing taking me? What can I do to support you in this moment? And by support you, I mean yourself. Whatever habits you may have that you already have in your life, but maybe aren't using them, now is the time, because the loneliness of yourself doesn't go away if you're busy doing all these things. It bubbles up, or worse, it gets embedded in your system and starts creating health challenges because it needs your attention. And the more you reroute it, the more it implodes in your system and starts to create havoc in your body, in your emotions, and in your thoughts. The same thing is true with other people have been talking about the state of the world and that they feel so bogged down. What is the longing in there? What is the despair? And usually it's feeling helpless. Helpless is not feeling connected, because if there's so much vitriol, and I think it's getting to a point where even if you're on a side, it's starting to feel confusing. It starts waking up a deeper truth that, wow, we're disconnected as a culture. And that feels sad because you know inherently that we are all connected. So, what are the things that you can do when you're feeling potentially lonely because you desire deeper meaning in the world, or you desire deeper connection with your partner, or you're looking for a partner, or you're feeling challenged with your children? or you haven't been out in nature long enough to really see that in the midst of chaos, that the birds are flying and that there's all these beautiful things that are still happening. And is there a person in your life you can choose to be just a little more vulnerable with? Sometimes what happens is when there is a lot of challenge and we're feeling disconnected with other, we start either judging and or we start complaining, and it's a way that we're trying to reroute the heartache. If somebody said something to you or you want to say something to somebody that you love because you want to feel deeper or something that feels like has been unsaid, how can you do that? Write a letter to them. And if it has to start with a judgment, write all that you think that they've done wrong. Write all the ways that they've hurt you. But can you go beyond that? And can you actually step forward with yourself and show your own vulnerability and say, whatever that is that feels unsaid, can you ask for an audience? Can you walk into a space that you know is safe and allow yourself to share more? Sharing more of yourself will always reveal a deeper truth. If you are sharing your truth or sharing something that feels vulnerable in a way that is owning that for yourself, and you are doing that with somebody who's safe, who is an incredible witness, that will be powerful and healing. If you share with somebody that you feel is safe and they go into their own wound or own defensiveness, initially you could feel like, see, this is why I don't share myself. It's not safe. If that happens, can you have compassion and also tag they're in their wound? And can you witness that this gives you information of saying, oh, this relationship is not set up to go deeper. This relationship isn't set up to be able to have vulnerability be heard. Now, that is really important information to have, because if our relationships are limited in that way, you will not be inclined to share when you feel lonely. You will not be inclined to share when there's a longing, to share what's happening inside. That builds the loneliness because it builds the feeling of separation, that there's nowhere to share yourself. And this, my friends, is the epidemic. So, does it take some courage? Yes. Are there ways to ask for a sacred agreement? Yes. One of the things that I talk about in the Sacred Art of Desire workshop is something called active listening. So, you can ask somebody for active listening, which means their job is not to give you advice, is to just to truly listen and to acknowledge when what you have shared, to really receive and acknowledge and ask you if you have anything more to share on that. So there are different communication strategies. And I think that's one of the things that I've experienced, that we can have love, we can have desire, but if we don't have some aspect, especially when we're talking about other, of honoring and having sacred agreements and having communication strategies, it is hard. We need certain containers that give us the space and sacredness of being able to share with each other. I was speaking to someone this weekend and I was talking about one of my past partnerships, and that every Sunday we would sit down across from each other and we would simply ask, how's it going? And it was such a powerful thing to embed into our relationship, because it gave a space, a ritual for whatever is happening that may not get conversed on the regular day as we're doing our stuff. And it gave a safe place to share, because when things build up and we isolate within our relationships and we don't speak, then we stop trusting that and we stop being vulnerable. They become unhealthy habits in our relationship. One person gets defensive, one person walks away, we start losing our depth, our relationships start feeling flatter, we feel less connected, we feel less meaningful, we feel less passionate about our relationships. So that's when we start feeling lonely within our relationship, which is really the calling of the longing, is saying, oh, wait, you're longing for more vulnerability, to be known more deeply. And you're truly longing to feel safe and also know your partner or this person in relationship more deeply. These are some of the dynamics that show up in relationship or other when we're talking about loneliness. So, whether it be active listening, you know that one thing that you could possibly say that you've been wanting to say, just say it. Can you do something different with somebody? Can you go out in nature with your kids? Can you do something novel? Can you break up the routine? What are the ways in which you can sponsor connection? Instead of moving away from others when we're lonely, how can you move forward? Because when we don't and we just feel isolated and feel like we can't be loved, feel like no one listens to us, that's never because of anybody else. It's because of ourselves. In regard to the world and the culture, can you read beyond the mainstream media? Can you listen to a podcast that feels more open and viable to more connection versus polarization? I have to do that. I listen to things that remind me of our connection through our diversity. Can you choose to read a book that has a broader landscape of consciousness that can hold all perspectives? These are other ways in which you can remind yourself that you are connected, even though you feel like things are chaotic. Which brings me into something else when we're talking about loneliness in regard to the universe, in regard to our God, in regard to our spirit, our soul, our source. I was speaking to someone the other day that was feeling overwhelmed with the landscape of the world. And I said, one of the things that I do beyond what I just shared a moment ago is that I absolutely have to have some ritual of connection with something that I feel is a practice for the divine. It is a way to connect me with the greater, with the whole, with the love. If I didn't do that every day with who I am, I really probably would spontaneously combust. And it was great because after this conversation with this person, we did a session where it was focused on that energy that she could access. And what was great is it truly allowed her to digest the loneliness and expand the experience, remember the bigger part and connection of who she is in regard to the world, in regard to herself. And then she went and she had this beautiful time with her grandson that was richer and deeper. I would invite you to consider a focus on each. What's something you can do right now that supports your connection with self, that supports your connection with other, and that supports your connection with the divine? Know that loneliness is your birthright. I know that sounds funny, but think of loneliness as the longing, and think of loneliness as panging for what you truly desire, just as a gateway to bring you back on track, to bring you back into the remembering, to bring you back into your unique self as you continue to blossom as the beautiful soul and human being that you are. And it allows you to deepen your relationships and expand what is not only possible, but how much meaning you can find within yourself and others in your everyday. I hope that this has been helpful and supportive and loving, and that you feel truly the us too, and you let the longing wake up and guide you. May we dance in the range as much as possible while our flame is lit. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Until next time. And now, Trevor Hall with Blue Sky Mind.
Through the body, it's in and through the body.